Standing necessary?
No.
I think I can sit. Probably a little more comfortable for me too. I got a bad knee. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. For the next, 45 minutes, hour or so, talk a little bit about hurricanes and cover some of the history that you know, and maybe there's some history you don't know. I like to start with a few upfronts. I'll talk about myself in a minute, but one of the things we're going to do today is we're going to talk about two of my favorite topics, which is really history and science. And not often do they overlap in the way that they do with these storms, but what I want to share with you today are some stories, some of the great hurricanes that affected us here in North Carolina over the years. Talk about some of the things that happen to people, of course, but also talk a little bit about the weather science. And in my newest book, which came out last year, 15 Hurricanes That Changed the Carolinas, it's really a look at the history of what has happened, but also a look ahead at what to expect in the decades to come, because obviously that's a really hot topic right now. So, we need to understand our history, and we need science more than ever this day and age, and for people to understand, scientists do good work, and this is what they're telling us. So what I want to start with is that I'm not a meteorologist. I grew up in Southport, which is down on the coast below Wilmington, and as a coastal fella, a lot of parallels with what we have right here in Carteret County. I grew up working in crab houses and cleaning fish and doing a little shrimping and all that kind of stuff, but I was also on a surfboard a lot, always hoping that there'd be some kind of wave out there that I could ride. And it was usually in this time of year. September was a good month to get on your board and get out there, because that's when the swells were coming from the storms offshore. So along the way, I became, when I started working with the aquarium, even when I arrived over at the aquarium at Pine Mill Shores back in the early 80s, they had put together a Hurricane Awareness Week for the public to understand. And I got really interested in it and started researching it myself. And I started pulling old newspaper clippings and talking to Karen and Tony Seaman and all kinds of people from all over, this area, getting their stories. And next thing I knew, I had a big, thick folder, bigger than that one, of all kinds of interesting stuff about hurricanes. And I started putting slideshows together and doing them out there, and people loved it. And I thought, well, this is kind of a unique little niche here. I'm not a meteorologist, but I'm very interested in this history. So it started with Hazel, because in Southport, that was ground zero for that storm. Category 4, the only Category 4 on record to hit North Carolina. And so it was a real bad deal, but it was before I was born. Hazel came through in '54. But I had all the stories from my parents, from my neighbors, and those stories just resonated with me, and it all came back to me as I was working with the aquarium and started putting this together. And one day I just realized, I've got all this stuff, I've got all these pictures, these cool stories, people are interested, maybe I should write a book. I'd never written anything before, and I said, well, let me go talk to somebody, and I rang up the folks at UNC Press, and David Perry, and Dave was a good friend, and he said, this is good stuff. You should write this book. So we did, and that was back in 1992, and the book came out in '94. I'd say, and a sort of a sidebar, because I continue my work with aquariums. But what happened was I kept digging more and finding more stories, finding more interesting things to talk about, but also expanded out a little bit and started learning more about other parts of the United States, and ended up writing a book on Florida's hurricane history, which was a monumental task. Florida's had more than twice as many landfalls as we've had in North Carolina. And I don't live in Florida, so it was this was all the day before the internet even. I was using interlibrary loan to get all my work done. So it was really a journey for me to not only learn about the storms and then try to translate that and share that with the public through these books. And I think that, we were talking a little bit earlier, and every historian stands on the shoulders of the historians before me. So I rely on a lot of the resources that you can imagine, like the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center. They're great resources of data. But then there's also the other stuff you got to go find. You got to find the pictures. You got to find those personal tales of survival that people tell, and people love to talk about hurricanes. Everywhere I go, when I finish, there's almost inevitably somebody I ask to raise their hand and have a hurricane story that blows me away. A lot of times I end up getting my best stuff from my books from little talks like this. So some of you might have some stories you want to share too. So what I want to do is I'm going to kick around a little bit, but I want to frame this a little bit with regard to my book, 15 Hurricanes That Changed the Carolinas, and how I got to this point. This is my 5th book. When the folks at UNC Press, you might be familiar with this one, North Carolina's hurricane history. This was that one that came out in 1994, and then after that, the storms kept coming. So I had to keep doing updated editions. And you know, if you're writing about history that's always unfolding, you're never done. And that was the case. So that book's now in its 4th edition, but when it came time for a 5th, they said, you know, let's just do something different. So I took a slightly different approach. So this book, 15 Hurricanes, is really, what makes it different is I cherry-picked the 15 storms that I think are most meaningful for both North and South Carolina. So it's not just North Carolina, but there's a good bit about the South Carolina impacts as well. And how do you pick the 15? Well, you know, you have to look at the ones that are the biggest storms that did the most damage, that caused the most chaos, etc. And then when you go back in time, the farther back you go, of course, the details are not quite as complete. I don't have nearly the information I would love to have from some of the storms, say, from the 17th century. You know, we just don't have a lot of information. We have a few dates, a few episodes, and a lot of what happened during that early period, the pre-colonial period, was really recorded in shipwrecks and what happened along the North Carolina coast. David Stick's book, Graveyard Atlantic, of course, is a must-read for anybody who's interested in this topic, because he goes into great detail talking about a lot of the storms that affected the coast and the ships that went down and the stories that go along with that. And those all wrap together with what I've got in my books as well. So this 15 hurricane book, as I said a moment ago, I want to highlight the past, but more than just tell the story. I wanted to have some takeaways. What did we learn? What are we learning from all this history? I mean, that's why we study history, is to try to apply what we understand and maybe make a difference for the next storm that comes along. So as you go through the book, you'll see with each of these 15, I've identified a few takeaways, things that are simple lessons that we've learned. Now, in some cases, those takeaways are painfully obvious, like elevation matters. Real simple things like that. They're really obvious. But then in other cases, there are some takeaways. They're just things that we learned along the way that we didn't know, because things evolve. And one of the big things that evolved, of course, all through this history. The first storm I write about is in 1752, all the way up through Florence. So what happened during that period of time with the field of meteorology? Well, meteorology didn't exist in 1752. There was no science about weather. It was sort of starting to evolve in the 18th century. And then over time, it got better and better. But it wasn't until really the late 1800s that the U.S. government funded the U.S. Weather Bureau. We started to more accurately record and account for what's happening with these storms. So when you go back, if you look at the National Weather Service record for hurricanes, it's all online, the actual record only goes to 1851. And everything prior to 1851, we've got good information on some of those storms, but we don't really know all the details. We don't know the barometric pressures, we don't know exactly the tracks in a lot of cases, and we don't know deaths and dollars and all those kinds of statistical things that you might want to try to record. But we do have a good record from that point forward. So all the work that I put into telling the stories and then talking about the lessons we learned led me to the final chapter in this book, which is what to expect in the future. And I'll close my presentation today with a little bit about that, because I think that I had to learn a lot for myself. You can't always rely on just what you see on the media. Sometimes I wanted to talk to the people who really know. So I'll come back and talk about our future stuff. But let me go back and share a few things about some of the storms that are in the book that I've identified as part of the group of the 15. I'll start with that storm in 1752. This was a Charleston hurricane. Okay, this was known as the Charleston Hurricane 1752. And at that period of time, as you can imagine, the North Carolina coast was not very fully developed, but we had our storm up here too. There were 2 hurricanes in 1752. The first one hit Charleston. The second one hit down around probably Browns Beach, somewhere in Onslow County, and basically washed away the county seat of Onslow County, which was town of Johnston. The courthouse was swept away. All the deeds and all the records for everything in Onslow County was lost in that storm. Something like 8 or 10 fatalities. The jail flooded and several inmates drowned. It was a horrible story, there in 1752. That was following the storm in Charleston, which really made national news because Charleston was at that time becoming a thriving seaport, and the rise of agriculture, in particular rice and indigo, along the South Carolina coast was fueling the growth in Charleston. I mean, fine homes were going up. There was a lot of wealth. In fact, Charleston at that time was the wealthiest city south of Philadelphia. Well, the storm that came through was described as small but powerful. And we know from our experiences with hurricanes what they mean. Sometimes these storms are massive in diameter, very large. Sometimes they can be quite compact. This one was a compact one that came really packed a wallop. And all the homes in Charleston were pretty much just razed, just knocked to the ground. And most of them were timber structures like were built typically at that time. So one of the first takeaways that I put in the book was that architectural adaptation is probably one of the most important lessons we can learn from hurricanes. That if you go back and look at what happened in Charleston after that storm, when they went to rebuild, they shifted their techniques. They started using masonry, and they started building the homes with what they call the half basements. So you go to Charleston today, you'll see most all the homes have the half basement, which raises the living quarters up about 6 feet above the street. Something they didn't have before 1752. It seems pretty logical. Today in Charleston, they got real problems. Charleston is a city which is probably more so on the forefront of climate change than any other city in the nation. Miami gets a lot of press, but if you really look at what's happening in Charleston, it's compelling, because not only is sea level rising, but Charleston is sinking. And the combination of those two factors that causes, on a king tide, we've got water in the streets right now. So there's a lot in my book that talks about, I interviewed the emergency management folks and the folks in Charleston who are planning their future. Really a fascinating story, because we all love Charleston. It's such a beautiful city. The battery itself is another story. It chronicles through multiple hurricanes in my book about how the battery was destroyed, rebuilt, built a little higher. They changed the techniques. They started bringing in granite. Then they started using steel reinforcement. And then today, when you walk over the battery there in Charleston, you're walking over that history, because all the storms that came along, each one generated a new, improved version of what was there before. And so that architectural adaptation was really one of the first ones that kind of came to mind, along with the basic premise that I mentioned a moment ago about elevation, and I think everybody understands that. I even put in there that, for anybody who's moving to the area or thinking about buying property, everybody always talks about location, location, location. And I add to that, think about elevation, elevation, elevation. So the 1752 storm stands out because it was a powerful storm. It was early in the development of this nation, of course, but it changed a lot, and a lot of people paid attention to what happened there in Charleston that year. The next storm in the book is also a storm that mostly impacted South Carolina, and it was the storm of 1804. And this was a storm that I wrote it was much larger, it was very powerful, probably a Category 3. But what was interesting about it was this was a storm that swept the coast. And if you tried to pick a path, the worst path you could imagine for a major hurricane coming up the coast, it would be something like this. The storm comes ashore just east of Savannah and skirts along the coast just west of Charleston, then curves back to the northeast a little bit, just west of Wilmington, and then over the Outer Banks. So you swept all the major population centers at the time, in 1804, with that one storm, and they all were hammered. Georgetown, South Carolina, underwater. It was really a powerful storm, but a unique pattern with it. And there were all kinds of other stories. There's a whole Aaron Burr section in there, because as you recall, Aaron Burr had a famous duel with Alexander Hamilton and was fleeing the law and went to Hilton Head, and there he got stuck in the storm and barely survived as he was able to escape as the water rose in the plantation where he was staying. So anyway, there's some interesting stories about that one in there. I think that one of the things too that stands out about the 1804 storm was that, again, as a young nation, there was no preparation. I mean, we think about FEMA today, and we think about the resources we have to bear, and think about what you had in 1804, where the word didn't even get out about what happened along the coast for about a week. It took a week for Boston and New York to even know that there was a storm that had struck the coast. And that's sort of the nature of what you expect in 1804. We were talking earlier about the 1879 storm here in Carteret County and the demise of the Atlantic Hotel. And that's a story that's been told many times, and you may know it very well, but it was one that also led me to include a takeaway. It seems pretty obvious, and that takeaway is to heed official warnings. When they ask you to evacuate, you might want to get out. But that was the story at the Atlantic Hotel, where the North Carolina Press Association was holding their annual conference, and the proprietor had been warned by a soldier who came over from Fort Macon to say, you know, there's a low pressure, the pressure is falling, we know a storm is coming. You might want to think about moving these people out of this hotel, because this was, the Atlantic was built out over what is, I guess, now Taylor Creek. And as you probably know if you heard the story, that the storm rolled through some of the highest winds ever recorded in North Carolina out at Cape Lookout Lighthouse during that hurricane. And the Atlantic Hotel collapsed, and it was quite a calamity. The governor of North Carolina, Governor Jarvis, was in attendance, and supposedly, let's see, the story was he jumped out the window with his in his nightgown, and as everyone did, fleeing this hotel that was being swept into the waters, and survived. But all the residents of the hotel lost everything, and most of them were half naked, and they poured into town, and the good people of Beaufort took them in and gave them clothes and some warm place to ride the storm out. And Governor Jarvis appeared on the streets the following morning, and only the lady who he was staying with, the only clothing she had that would fit was her late husband's military suit from the War of 1812, which was about 4 sizes too small. And so all day long, the governor walked around commanding orders, wearing this silly looking suit, and the newspapermen were all there and having a really good time making fun of him about it. So little stories like that. Certainly want to give full credit to Virginia Doughton for her wonderful book on the Atlantic Hotel. The Sansarico storm, 1899, is another one that gets a lot of press. A lot of people in this area know it well because this is the storm that destroyed Diamond City, or that was the last straw for the cave anchors. And I think what happened was, it was, as you probably know, if you follow this history, it was a progression of storms through the late 1800s, starting in 2 storms in 1893, I believe there's another one in 1896, and all of those storms were chipping away at this community. They're in the shadow of the lighthouse. The population, I believe, somebody help me with this, at one time was about 850 people. Probably by the time this 1899 storm rolled through, it was down to about 400 to 500, but still a thriving little community there, made their living whaling, fishing, and it was this storm that really just did them in, because the waters swept over the banks, flooded their wells, removed all their vegetable gardens, and destroyed a lot of their homes and boats. But what happened was they said, this is just it. We're not going to try this anymore. We're going to move back to the mainland, and they did. And many of them hauled their houses over a period of months and years, hauled their houses over to new places like Marshallburg, Parker's Island, and Promised Land in Morehead City, and even in Salter Bay. So that's a story that has been told and retold here locally, but a lot of people that are not from this area have not heard that. And it's one of the few examples that I can think of. There are a couple, but one of the few examples I can think of wholesale retreat as a result of hurricanes. Most communities weather the storm and they try to pick up the pieces and build it back. And this was a case where they said, we're just not going to do this anymore. And so that's the Sansarico storm. In a lot of ways, that's a great Carter County story. But if you talk to folks up on Hatteras Island, and some of the stories up there are even more shocking and scary. There's so many. There were several different reports from Hatteras Island that still to this day are chilling. If you go up there and you find some of these landmarks and realize how deep the water was when the water swept over, it was very, very impressive. So that storm in 1899, one of the things that I had as a takeaway for that, I did talk about retreat and how retreat today in 2023 seems impossible. How could Atlantic Beach or Emerald Isle or Whitesville Beach or Myrtle Beach or any of these places ever back away from these storms? Well, that's probably not going to happen. The other takeaway from the 1899 storm was one that is a recurring theme, and you'll see it in several parts of my books, and that is that it's really not unusual at all to get hit by more than one hurricane in the same year. And 1899 was an example, because not only did you have the Sansarico storm, which is very likely a Cat 3 at landfall, but there was a second storm that struck on Halloween Day down at Wilmington Whitesville Beach that was also probably a Category 3. So that's sort of like getting 2 Frans in 1 year, if you can imagine. Same thing happened in 33, 55. There are many other examples where we've had more than one in the same season. So that's one of the lessons there. Rolling forward, one of the stories that I always enjoy talking about this one, because people sometimes are shocked when I throw up my slides. I'm not showing slides today, but I throw up my slides of all this destruction, and then you can see the Blue Ridge Mountains in the background. And that's because this was the great asheville flood of 1916. And if you know anything about that flood, certainly the greatest flood in North Carolina's history prior to Floyd, and may have been the most deadly flood in North Carolina's history, because we don't really know how many deaths, but there was estimates of 80 plus in our state. But this was a story that originated with 2 hurricanes. And you can imagine, everybody knows where Asheville is. The first hurricane struck the South Carolina coast as a Cat 2, fairly significant Cat 2, just above Myrtle Beach, barreled inland, went through Charlotte, sort of like Hugo, and went on up into the mountains. And at the same time was another hurricane that made landfall on the Mississippi coast as a Category 3, probably about 3 days later. Both storms tracked inland and began to dissipate. And as all that rain mass reached the Blue Ridge, you can imagine what happened. It would just unleash a torrent. And in fact, it set a new U.S. rainfall record. It was in July 11th, 1916, of 22.22 inches of rain in 24 hours. In 1916, that was the most ever recorded. Well, we're way past that now, but that was a big deal back then. And when you get that much rain falling on the steep slopes of mountains, you can imagine the impact. Every bridge and railroad trestle on every river west of Winston-Salem was destroyed. So North Carolina was cut in half. There was no transportation possible. None of the trains could run. In fact, the Southern Railway, it didn't go bankrupt, but everything shut down because many of the hubs for the rail traffic was all in that area. And it was a big, big problem because rescue teams couldn't go anywhere. I mean, you couldn't go beyond the next river. The rivers stayed high for a long time too, made it very difficult to transport supplies. And it was just a shocking thing for all the people in western North Carolina who'd never seen anything like it before. Didn't even know it was a hurricane. All they knew was it was a massive mudslide. Many homes were washed down off the sides of mountains. A lot of tragic stories in the 1916 flood. Even right there around Biltmore. Biltmore Village, we've all been to Biltmore, probably. Biltmore Village had 6 to 10 feet of water in the village there as a result of the flooding that came through. So it was probably a no-brainer to pick this takeaway, and that one was you don't have to live at the coast to get slammed by a hurricane. There are lots of other examples beyond just the 1916 storm, of course. You know, we've got Hugo in Charlotte, and Hazel in Raleigh, and Fran in Raleigh, and Rocky Mount, and other places. So anyway, I do want to go back because I skipped one. I want to make a comment about the 1893 hurricane, which takes up a lot of pages in my book because it was a very big storm, mostly in South Carolina. In 1893, one of the things that had happened was that the U.S. Weather Bureau had recently completed underground cable lines through some of the portions of the Caribbean, or I should say more like the Bahamas. And we were starting to begin to develop a network that we could communicate and know what's happening as these storms are approaching. And believe it or not, the Weather Bureau issued the first ever hurricane warning for an approaching storm in the U.S. On that date, August of whatever, in 1893. Well, they issued the warning, but then what happened? Well, all the poor people along the coast, most of whom were black farmers, landowners, who had been freed slaves there in Hilton Head and Hunting Island, all that low country area, sort of the southern end of South Carolina. They had no way of getting the information. So the warning was issued, but nobody told anybody. And this storm came in and was absolutely devastating. It was a storm surge of probably about 16 feet, arrived at high tide, all the bad things you don't want to happen when a storm hits. And the loss of life was massive, probably between 2,800 and 3,500 lives that were lost. And what was shocking about that was it was by far the most deadly natural disaster that Americans had ever seen. 2 weeks later, another storm hit Louisiana and killed another 2,500 people. That was in 1893, and just 7 years later, we had the Galveston hurricane, which killed probably between 10 and 12,000 people. So it was a time of mass casualties, and it was really a race. How can we get ahead of this? How can we improve our forecasting and warning to let people know to save themselves? One of the most compelling stories about the 1893 storm, too, was about Clara Barton, because this was a time when Unfortunately, there was still a lot of racial tension. Disenfranchisement was a big deal in South Carolina in particular. And when the word arrived back to the legislature and to the governor in South Carolina about this horrible loss of life, there was no appropriation for funds for rescue or for recovery or for anything. Congress was, they pled, please help us with this recovery. We've got a massive catastrophe here. Nothing from Congress but just lip service almost. Clara Barton, who founded the Red Cross in 1871, she had been fighting wildfires in Michigan or something and heard about this storm, came down, and she had actually lived in Hilton Head for a period during the war. And so she knew about, she knew the area, and she said, I've got to go there. So she went to investigate for herself. She met with the mayor of Charleston and several others, and it was obvious that they needed her badly. And she rallied the largest response that the Red Cross had ever done up until that point, raised thousands of dollars, had trainloads of food shipped in, and it was really Clara Barton and the Red Cross that saved those people. And what they did was, the calamity was that all these people had died, and you had that to deal with, and you had the cleanup. But then there was no food because all the topsoil had been washed away. Most of the farm fields were still staying with salt water. So ditches had to be dug, they had to drain the fields, they had to replant. It was a massive effort because there was probably 35,000 people that it would have been a famine. 35,000 people living in that county, and Clara Barton saved their lives. And it was a remarkable story, and tried to give it justice in my book, talking about that story. There's one more thing about the 1893 that I think is very compelling. And I've already mentioned this a moment ago, that we can have small hurricanes or we can have large hurricanes, and it really doesn't have a correlation with wind strength. You can have a big one that's powerful, or you can have a big one that's not powerful, or small and so forth. The 1893 storm is probably one of the largest hurricanes in diameter ever to strike the U.S. Hurricane Sandy would have been a pretty good runner-up. Sandy was almost 1,000 miles in diameter when it made landfall in the Northeast. This storm was probably about 800 to 900 miles in diameter. And what that meant was, as it tracked inland across South Carolina, I'm sorry, how many counties are there in South Carolina? I think 70. All the counties in South Carolina received heavy wind damage. And you think about that from Horry County, Myrtle Beach, all the way down to Hilton Head, all the way to Tennessee line. You've got heavy wind damage from this storm rolling through. Very, very powerful storm, and it's really one of the hurricanes that meteorologists hold up as one of the great hurricanes in U.S. history that they study because of its meteorological differences that this particular one had. All right, I'm jumping around a little bit. I'm going to go back and just say a word or two about the 1933 storm, which was, of course, arrived during the Great Depression, and the folks at the National Hurricane Center go back and they do a reanalysis of past storms. And when they went back and they did the reanalysis of this was news to me. They determined that the eye of this storm never made landfall in North Carolina. It hung right off the coast between Ocracoke and Hatteras and sat there. And it was that center of the storm sitting in one spot for a little period of time that generated all those northeast winds that flooded everything down east. And the devastation, particularly in Carteret County and Pamlico County, was the greatest. A lot of tragedies. I talked about them in the book. There was a story of the Caraway family that lost their child. I know that there was also the Dixon family. There were several. You probably know many of these descendants are still around, but there are ties to that storm that still are very much alive here in Carteret County. And there are even people that will take you down and show you, how high the water got on the back of the barn, that kind of thing. One of the most chilling stories was the report from the Red Cross upon their arrival down in Roe or Cedar Island. It was 5 days after the storm, and those families, it was about 10 or 12 families down on Cedar Island that nobody had heard from, and they were feared to have been just swept away. And the Red Cross sent a rescue boat down there with some food to check on them. And it was like 5 days later, and they found them, and they were up in the trees. The island was still covered with water. Many of them were in the trees with no clothes. Many of them had been bitten by copperheads and all kinds of just horrible, horrible stories that you can imagine, not only surviving the storm, but then having to sort of deal with the aftermath in not a very pleasant way. Really a powerful storm in the telling of local history. And I think probably for Carteret County, there may not be another storm quite like it. There are others that have been bad. Of course, we were talking about Donna earlier and Hazel and some of the others, but certainly the 33 storm stands out. And then Hazel itself in '54 was followed by, the very next year, 3 storms in 1955 that made landfall in North Carolina. So that was a period of time in the 50s where, for whatever reason, it got real busy, real fast with regard to hurricanes. We had something like 11 hurricanes in 10 years in North and South Carolina. 2 of those being Category 4s. The Hazel was a Cat 4, and Gracie was a Cat 4 in '59 down in South Carolina. So Hurricane Alley was the nickname that we got here from the national news media. And Hazel was a storm that started deep in the Caribbean. A lot of times when we watch the Weather Channel and they're talking about stuff coming off of Africa, those are the Cape Verde type hurricanes. But understand that they're coming pretty much through the peak of the season. They usually start, those Cape Verde storms usually start by the middle of August, and by the end of September that winds down. And the emphasis shifts back to the deep Caribbean. And that's where Hazel was born on October the 4th, and then it eventually came up, hit Haiti and killed over 1,000 people in Haiti. And then one of the tragedies, even before it got to North Carolina, beyond the devastating impact in Haiti, was a meteorologist in Miami who was the lead forecaster. He was a very experienced forecaster. There wasn't a hurricane center in 1954. This is before the hurricane center. This was just the National Weather Service office in Miami. He was responsible for doing all the forecasting himself. And as Hazel swept over Haiti, he was working around the clock, working like 18-hour days and really just pushing himself. And he had a stroke and died at his desk, right as Hazel passed off of Haiti. And his young 21-year-old intern was then assigned the responsibility to issue forecasts for Hurricane Hazel approaching the United States. And did, but it's interesting when you go back and look at those forecasts and you look at the warnings, they're very general. Tropical cyclone approaches southeast coast. All marine interests advised to take heed, that kind of a warning. So no one really knew exactly where Hazel was going to go. This is before the days of satellites. We couldn't look at it from outer space. And coastal radar there was some radar, but it didn't really help you until the storm was really right on you. That's when you started seeing it on the radar. So it was a guessing game, but eventually some phone calls were made, and I talk in the book about it, particularly down in Myrtle Beach. This was October, so most of the beach cottages were empty. Nobody lived on the beach or thought about going to the beach much in October unless you were a fisherman. So most of those places were empty, and that was a good thing. But they still had some people to evacuate, and they got a call. The North Myrtle Beach police chief got a call at 10:30 while I was grilling steak. Have you started your evacuation? He said, evacuation for what? I mean, that's the status we were in 1954. It wasn't that long ago. But as you know, Hazel was a Cat 4 when it struck. It rolled on through Brunswick County and all across North Carolina. It went right through Raleigh. But what happened as it passed into Virginia is it accelerated. We talk a lot about all the bad things with Hazel. It was a full moon, high tide, March and high tide, It was, we didn't have the great forecasting to know exactly what it was going to do, but it was also made landfall at 25 miles an hour. Now that forward speed has a lot to do with what happens to you. You know, we saw with Florence, you know, it slowly moved along. You could walk faster than Florence passed. Hazel, 25 when it hit, by the time it got into central Virginia, it had a forward speed of 50 miles an hour. So what does that mean? From a physics standpoint, you've got a rotating storm with winds, let's say, of 120 miles an hour. And then as you move forward, everything on the east side of that storm, you're going to add 50 to it. And that's why we had new wind speed records all along the East Coast with Hurricane Hazel, from South Carolina to Delaware to New York and on. The highest wind ever recorded in New York City was 113 mile per hour gusts down the Battery during Hurricane Hazel. I think it was 100 mile per hour gusts recorded in 7 states. And as the storm raced northward, and a lot of people who are from Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York, they have their own Hazel stories, I can tell you. As it raced northward, not really so much a flood, not much rain, it was mostly wind. But then when it got to upstate New York, it merged with a low pressure coming off of the Great Lakes and went on to become the greatest flood in Canadian history. Actually killed more people in Canada than it had killed in the United States. We were really lucky in North Carolina. There were only 19 fatalities in our state, even though it was a Cat 4. But it was because it was in 1954, and it was because it was in October. I can tell you, that had a lot to do with it. That busy period in the 50s then kind of wound down with Donna in 1960. Donna was another one of those big storms that got a lot of press because we had seen so many bad storms. Now the media was really on it. They were starting to cover hurricanes in a really meaningful way, digging in with more detail. And Hurricane Donna made landfall in the Keys as a Cat 4, one of the strongest ever in the Keys, not compared to the Cat 5 in 1935, but swept through the Keys as a Cat 4, and then it turned right there around Naples and then struck Florida from the west coast and went right across Florida as a Category 3, back into the Atlantic off Jacksonville, right up the coast, back to Category 3 strength, came ashore right here in Morehead City, and then snuck back offshore off Virginia, back out to sea again, hit New England as a Category 3. The only hurricane of record to have hit Florida and Carolina as a hurricane. So Donna's track was mighty impressive. The impacts here probably mostly felt, we were talking about earlier, out here on the beach and then as well on the causeway. Causeway to Beaufort was completely washed out. The trains washed off the tracks. There's a great story in there about an expectant mother trying to get to the hospital and couldn't quite make it in a hearse of all things. So there's a great story there. Donna, the other thing that I used to, years ago, I used to work at the Dunes Club when I was in college, and I love this story because the Dunes Club was destroyed during Hazel and during Donna. And during Donna, the roof blew off, the walls kind of collapsed, and the dance floor ended up on Fort Macon Road. And I got a photograph of that. So a lot of people have danced on that dance floor and probably have a lot of memories from seeing it out there on the middle of the road.
So that was in like 56?
That was in Donna was in 60, September of 1960. Yeah. So following Donna, something kind of weird happened, and I talk about this a little bit in the book too. We went through a long, quiet period here in the Carolinas. Florida had been hammered in the 40s. They had like 13 storms in 10 years in Florida, and then it shifted to the Carolinas, and then it just went quiet. Now, one of the things I found out when talking to my Hurricane Center friends is that there is a long-term cycle that you don't see this talked about very much. It's called the AMOD, the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation. So without getting too technical on all this stuff, everybody's familiar with La Nina and El Nino, right? It goes back and forth. It wavers. That's about a 4 to 7 year oscillation. and it has to do with cold water in the Pacific upwelling, and it changes weather patterns. So that oscillation is 4 to 7 years. Well, this one is probably 30 to 40 year oscillation, and it's in the North Atlantic. And basically what it does is the sea surface temperature shifts about 1 degree or 1.5 degrees, and then it'll stay that way, and then it'll shift back for a period of 30 to 40 years. Well, guess what? That period, the cool period, started right there in the late 50s and went all the way into the 80s, 90s. And we did have some storms during that period of time, but it shifted back to the warm period in 1995. So everything we've had since 1995, you can give a little bit of credit to that. You hear a lot about global warming and how is that going to impact us, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is something to consider that's separate from that. And one of the theories is that we should be entering that cool period here pretty soon. Well, what's happened though is that as temperatures continue to rise, it's probably going to mask that cool period. So we may not notice the benefit of it that we had during the 60s and 70s. The whole time I was growing up looking for good weather, we didn't have any hurricanes. So I guess that's a good thing. But it happened, the 60s and 70s happened to be a period of time when explosive growth happened along the coast too. That's when you started to see bridges built, homes built, condos and restaurants and the rest. So, you know, complacency is a real problem for anybody in emergency management. And hurricanes is it's a real issue. We might think, gosh, we get hurricanes a lot around here. We kind of know what we're doing, but there are lots of parts of the country that don't. And just look at South Florida, Southwest Florida really had been a long time without a storm until, you know, we had storms just in the last couple of years. And then the one that struck in the Big Bend area just earlier this year, first time in 100 years that a major storm had hit there. So you can go a long, long time, you know, you can, depending upon your location, in between storms. And by that time, you know, people lose sight of things. So its complacency is a big issue. When we get up into the more recent storms, like Floyd, Fran, and then of course Matthew and Florence, what I want to say about that is I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because that's more current and you probably remember them pretty well. Certainly each one has its own challenges, and there's all kinds of wisdom to be derived from what we have seen, what we've learned. You know, really basic things that I put in there as takeaways. You know, one of the basics is that just because it hasn't flooded before doesn't mean it can't flood. And that's something that was learned during Floyd, during Matthew, during Fran, and the corollary that goes along with that is if it's flooded before, it can flood again. And you know, that's one of the things that, as I look at it, we struggle with, we all struggle with, not just in North Carolina, but everywhere, is how do you keep homes from flooding over and over again? That's when you really have problems, when you've got a house that is flooded, it gets repaired, and then another storm comes along and does the same thing again. You know, it's that definition of lunacy, right? So I think one of the things that I dug into a little bit was the whole business of the flood insurance program, how flood zone mapping is done, and there are lots of problems. North Carolina right now has some of the best flood maps in the nation, but every day they get older because floodplains change all the time. And so what we're finding now is that FEMA will even tell you that you know, your flood map updates are probably on the range of 5 to 10 years out. And that's not good enough, frankly. When you look at the number of properties in North Carolina that were flooded, over half of the properties in Florence were not in flood zones. Over half the properties that were flooded were not in flood zones. Flood insurance is undersold, unfortunately, in many parts of the state. And I'm not so much talking about at the coast. I'm talking now about more our river communities, even up towards Fayetteville and you know, Kinston, up that way. There are a lot of concerns. So there are tons of takeaways that we've learned just in these recent storms. But one of the biggest ones too is to expect the unexpected. Everybody needs to think about hurricanes that way. There's always going to be something you haven't seen before. With Hurricane Floyd, it was swiftwater rescue. You know, all those 1,800 lives were saved during Hurricane Floyd by helicopter, or from the air, I should say. 1,800 people. And in many cases, there weren't enough swiftwater boats to, the police didn't own them. They had to go out and borrow boats, or people just volunteered. They showed up down at the fire station with their skiff and said, let's go to work. And that's sort of that grassroots, you know, effort to save ourselves. But the lesson that we learned was now you go out across North Carolina and you'll find brand new boats, trained personnel. They got the equipment, they got the safety lines, they got all the stuff they need to effect safe rescues. And not only that, but these teams are equipped to travel. So we have teams from Ohio and Florida that come in for swiftwater rescue now. So that was a hard lesson. I'll go back to Hugo. I skipped over Hugo a little bit. But Hugo in '89 was a wake-up call because the field of emergency management was born during Hurricane Hugo. And what happened was it was such a poor response in South Carolina, and the complaints were so loud that major investigations were done, and they said, well, we're not spending enough money. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough resources. We got to pre-stage things. You know, all these were lessons that came the hard way because we suffered through a big storm like a Floyd or like a Hugo, and my God, we got to do better next time. That's kind of what everybody's attitude was, and each time it has gotten a little bit better. Had the storms gotten worse? I wouldn't say that, but what has happened, and that's one of probably the most important takeaways from my book, is not that we are experiencing worse storms than we used to, or bigger storms, or meaner storms. It's that we've got more people and property in harm's way. That's really the story. Look at the population today compared to what it was in the 50s when Hazel or Donna rolled through. No comparison. No comparison. It's not only the inflation factor, it's the wealth factor. Because if you own a boat and a house and a car in 1954, and you look at how much you spend on your boat, your house, and your car today compared to then, it's an order of magnitude different. So as Secretary of Agriculture told me one time, you know, you can have a tree fall on a farm implement and cause $250,000 worth of damage. And that has happened. So there's all kinds of little stories like that that fit together to help us better appreciate what we're dealing with here. I don't want to run too far over time. So what I want to do is wrap up with just a couple of last comments about the future. Because people ask all the time, and I know that there are still some people who have questions about climate change, but I will just tell you my perspective is, number one, 100% we have a climate crisis on this planet. And it is, when you really dig down into it, it's way more than just hurricanes. And you see a lot of it starting to emerge in the media and stories and books that you see now. But with regard to hurricanes, I was particularly interested in this because I kind of feel like the media doesn't get it right sometimes. So this is how I looked at it. I was watching, I think it was NBC News or something, they were talking about one of the storms, and the reporter's conclusion was, well, this is climate change. This hurricane, look at all this damage, this is climate change. And, you know, and I write in the book, I said, you know, I don't think that's really honest. I don't think that from a historian's perspective, you can't blame our planet's challenges with rising temperatures on, you know, you can't blame the hurricane on that. It may be a factor, it may be weighing in. So I had to go out and do a little research. So I started with my good friend, and you'll love this. I've known him for 30 years. He's now the director of the National Hurricane Center Research Division. So he's at the Hurricane Center, but he's over all the research that they do. And I figure there's nobody else that could answer this question any better than him. And his name happens to be Chris Landsea, which I think is probably the perfect name for an atmospheric scientist. So Chris and I did an interview, and I learned some things that were really fascinating. And I'll break it down for you in the short version, so it won't keep you all day. hurricanes and climate change. What are we going to expect? What's happening? What should we expect? The first thing he said was their computer models, which they are fine-tuning all the time, they run these projections out based on how much CO2 and other gases are being released and what the effect will be, and they recalculate and they run all these computer scenarios out all the way to 2100, to the end of the century. And he said that their calculations suggest that by 2100, we won't have more hurricanes than we have now. The number of storms is probably not going to change. But that's not really any comfort because we already have plenty of storms. The average hurricane season now is something like seven hurricanes, 14 named storms in the average year in the Atlantic Basin. And 7 and 14 that's plenty. So, but will we see more? They don't think so. The second thing is we're always concerned about the winds from hurricanes and what's going to happen. Are they going to get a lot more powerful? And their projection is that they will get more powerful, fueled by climate change, but only by about 5% by the year 2100. So what he's saying is that a 100-mile-per-hour hurricane today in 2100 might be a 105-mile-an-hour hurricane. So you can take that for what it's worth. It's not nothing, but it is not life-altering either. It sounds to me like that's something we could probably expect with a warmer planet. But the last one is, it is a concern, and it's the evidence is building that hurricanes in the future are going to be wetter. They're going to hold more water, they're going to rain more, and if some of the blocking patterns develop that they expect, they will move more slowly. And so that's a wicked combination. That's Florence all over. Slow moving, large, and wet. And that's not a good recipe for North Carolina. If you look at our history of storms, most of ours are Cat 1s and Cat 2s. We don't typically see the Cat 3s and Cat 4s that you find farther south, and that's good. Just remember that that's a scaled wind only. When you're measuring a hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson scale, you're only talking about wind. It has nothing to do with storm surge, it has nothing to do with flooding. So always remember that. But our storms here, like Florence and like Matthew, are examples of kind of the storms we'll have in the future. And they're frankly, they're bad at the coast, but some of the most vulnerable areas in our state right now are just up the river. And we know that that's something we have to anticipate and sort of be prepared for. So it's not comforting by any stretch to hear this, but I think it's enlightening to get a little better handle on it, because sometimes I think, bless them, the folks who report the news, they want to make it simple for everybody. And I would argue that climate change is going to be a factor increasingly, but it's not what's causing these storms to come and strike us. And we know that I even say this in that chapter, that if you want to try to guess what the next 100 years of hurricanes is going to look like, the best place to start is to look at the last 100 years, because we've had some big ones, but they tend to be far apart. The Hazels and the Hugos and the Frans, they don't come around every year, but Murphy's Law, you can get them two in the same year, and then not have one for a decade. That's just the nature of what this is about. When you're studying these storms, you can't look at a 20-year period and say, okay, well, what's happened? What can we learn from this? You've got to have a long view for these hurricane cycles and for the impacts for any given location, because it might be 50 years or 80 years before you see another big Hazel type storm or Hugo on our coast, or it could be 2 weeks from now.